Morning.
Morning.
Chair Williams, I believe we have everyone present and we can begin whenever you are ready.
Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order at 9 a.m. and invite the clerk to conduct roll call.
Chair Williams?
Here.
And Committee Member Mulhern?
Here.
Thank you.
And Supervisor Mulhern, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
On to public expression, do we have any members of the public who'd like to comment on items of interest?
We do not.
Okay. Moving on to agenda item 2A, discussion and possible action regarding requests for direction to staff on the consideration of the review and update of all county social media use policies and county social media handbooks. And the sponsor is County Council and the Executive Office. County Council, would you like to introduce?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the committee had previously tasked County Council, Executive Office, and HR with working through some issues related to the social media policy. We've worked on a draft which we have gone ahead and attached, but there's a few sort of areas where I think we need further direction before finalizing anything. And for reference, I've also included a copy of the Sonoma County. Or sorry, not Sonoma County, the Shasta County social media policy that they had recently adopted. This has been something that's been of interest to a number of counties, and there have been a number of updates. This seems to have been based on what's a relatively common model that we see going around California. There are a few things I want to make sure that the committee is aware of. First of all, with respect, one of the things from the prior direction had been to look at the possibility of sort of addressing off-duty social media use in a similar way to what the Sheriff's Office has in their policy manuals. I believe HR and LCW were working on that, but there's been turnover on both of those fronts, in that the HR director has retired, and we've actually switched vendors from LCW to a new outside firm. I talked with Sherry earlier today, and it sounds like we need to get that piece may have not had a smooth handoff there, so we need to figure out, to what degree there needs to be any addressing of that if the board wants to take action on that through a potential meet and confer. But that would be a relatively limited piece of this. From County Council's perspective, the big issue with respect to the social media has to do with comments and moderation. And in particular, there's no obligation for the county to have comments enabled on any sort, or to allow for any sort of response or forum in any venue that the county is engaging in social media. So you can essentially have, say, a Facebook page or other sort of social media account that simply has comments disabled, and there's no issue there. But if the comments are allowed, that does create a First Amendment issue in terms of any efforts to moderate or control the content of the comments that are on the page. Now, we've talked to several departments about sort of their differing needs, and we've found that there's been a certain amount of I think different perspective, but also different needs among the various departments that we've spoken to on these issues. Some want, or some have no particular need for comments, because their function is really only to get the information out there. Others are looking for, information or feedback that may be helpful to the agency, and then some. And I don't know that we're going to be able to fully accommodate this desire, but some seem to want to have essentially fostering a forum where they allow certain types of community discussion, but at the same time trying to sort of place some limits and controls on it that may sort of foster desirable discussion rather than what might otherwise be found in an online forum. And we've also found that there's been a very highly variable level of resources and sort of sophistication with respect to the social media engagement. So, some departments may be, putting it sort of higher up the food chain, if you will, in terms of who is managing the policy, and others maybe going a bit further down, and may have staff that are not as familiar, with some of the relevant considerations. So where that's leading is that we've got sort of two pieces of the policy that I think are particularly significant, in which we could use some more direction on. The first has to do with to what extent the board wants to allow or encourage having a policy that will actually prohibit certain types of content within comments, if the comments are allowed. So one option that one option that the board would have would be to simply say it's sort of all or nothing on comments. Either we have comments enabled and there's no moderation, or there is there's moderation but or there's no comments, or there's comments but no moderation. Another option would be to simply have a policy sort of reciting, and what's relatively common, and what we see from, say, the Shasta model and from a number of others, is that there may be sort of recitations of categories that are constitutionally permissible to be regulating within a limited public forum, but without sort of a whole lot of definition or explanation as to what exactly goes within those policies and how exactly the enforcement occurs. So one thing that we find is that a lot of these policies will use terms that are maybe of legal significance, but we make very hard for sort of line staff to understand, when it is or is not allowable to go ahead and delete a comment. So, for example, defamation is very commonly listed in many of the policies, and yet defamation, turns on. Defamation is not simply a disparaging comment. It's a very sort of narrowly confined legal issue that has to do with a statement that is false, that is damaging to someone's reputation, is understood, or it is potentially understood to be true. So it's not just sort of hyperbole or overstatement, and then is made sort of without the requisite level of care as to determining whether or not it's truthful. So for a non-public figure, that would be a negligence standard. For a public figure, that would be a recklessness standard. Another area that we've seen it. So, for example, the Shasta policy has a category that lists. I believe it's statements that would tend to promote harassment or be harassing towards specific groups. And harassment may be sort of a permissible area of regulation. In fact, there may be even some legal requirements on us if we were to be allowing the forums to be used for harassment of staff, for example, on the basis of race, gender, or other protected classification. However, there's also some case law that talks about essentially group defamation, statements that are simply disparaging towards groups generally on the basis of race, et cetera, may not be protected. And so sort of parsing that out can be very difficult, I would say, even for attorneys and judges, but especially for any staff that may be charged with actually applying the policy and deleting individual comments. And so one of the concerns that we have on sort of the policy side is making sure not just that a policy is potentially sort of legally permissible, but that it is also something that would be workable in a way that's not going to be leading to sort of unnecessary legal challenges, or even more concerningly would be successful legal challenges. And part of the concern there is that any First Amendment challenge would probably be brought under 1983, and thus involve an entitlement to attorney's fees. So even if the damages were nominal, there's potentially some meaningful exposure on the part of the county there. Anyway, so where that goes is sort of, the question is really, to what degree is the board going to be sort of wanting to have, there's really sort of two questions here. One is, to what degree is the board wants to have policies sort of addressing the level of enforcement and the level of moderation within the comments, and then the other is going to be sort of, to what degree are you going to be wanting to leaving that to the individual departments. So there's a few models that we see as potentially working. One would simply be the sort of all or nothing approach. That might be accommodated or included, still in a recitation of areas that would be constitutionally permissible to ban, but simply maybe not include dedicating the resources towards actually enforcing that. And another concern that we have on the enforcement front is sort of if the enforcement is inconsistent, right? So if a lot of offensive or policies that would be, or a lot of statements that would be violating the policies are permitted, but then one sort of catches the ire of staff and then ends up getting deleted, do we then end up with essentially a de facto policy or practice that would be violating the First Amendment? And so there's the all or nothing approach. Another option would be to allow it sort of be department by department. My understanding is that some counties essentially had draft the policy and then just sort of, I don't mean to be too facetious, but they sort of hope that the individual departments will apply it correctly, or they leave it to the discretion of the departments to go ahead and apply that. And then, one option is, to essentially have the, list of categories that may be prohibited, but then say that, any department prior to enforcing has to develop an enforcement plan that then may be reviewed by county council and by, or executive office as possibly as well for, for any concerns in terms of the resources and the legality of the whole level of enforcement. And then the last option is that if the board really wanted, I mean, we could do something that would be consistent sort of across, across the entire county in terms of a process for deletion and then review of potential deletion of comments. So, we could potentially set up a structure that would, specify the level of review, the types of checks, et cetera, that would be going into that. And, what I had sort of hoped starting the process was that maybe, there would be enough of a consistent understanding, I think, among all the departments that it would be relatively straightforward to go with, more or less the all or nothing approach, just because it doesn't seem like we have a lot of resources for removing comments, but there have been enough of a variety of opinions out there that I wanted to make sure that I'm getting sort of adequate committee and board direction on this before we go ahead and make our additional changes to the policy.
Supervisor, do you have any comments?
I was going to check if there was public first, and then I'll go
Okay,
ahead.
I'm going to give mine then, and then we'll go to public. So this is a county that's basically broke. We don't have money to carry out core mandated services. I don't think we should establish rules if we can't enforce. I don't see funds for enforcing. The idea that the county would be in a position to moderate various social media forums, I can predict where that'll go. It'll be a lot of complaints about the way we're moderating, and which will use more resources that we don't have. So let's, Clerk, do we have any public comment on this item?
No, we do not.
Supervisor?
I think it's really important that the public and the community are able to interact, especially on our county pages. And I understand the lack of resources that we have. As Council Curtis mentioned, some departments are more equipped and able to handle their social media use, better than others. And I think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges. I think a blanket of allowing comments at least allows people to feel like their voices are heard. There are algorithms that you can put in place on the Facebook pages that will automatically hide profane content and certain other explicit content. So we would be able to use that as at least a stopgap from departments having to constantly monitor the social. And I also, I'm not necessarily opposed to just letting the public comment and just knowing that we may not respond. If it's in the top of in our about section on a Facebook page, for instance, and it simply says, here are the rules, just so you know, this page is not monitored or this page is not actively moderated. And we put that out there in the very beginning. I think that's, I guess, like good enough. Rather than just turning off comments, I think it's important that the public's able to respond to things that are happening within the county.
I could support that. And maybe, is it possible to ask individual departments to come back with and apprise us as to what they think they can perform in moderation with the resources they have, and what is their desire? Public health versus DOT may have different needs and different resources available. But I guess I worry if we say turn it on for DOT and there's comments about potholes and road work timing, and somebody needs to follow up. I don't think we can, if we go down a path where comments are on, but county staff doesn't respond to comments, that will generate distrust. And go ahead.
Sorry, that sounded like a directive, and is the directive to leave comments on social media posts?
But Supervisor, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think just for the clerk, we're not quite ready for the directive yet. We're still hashing this out a little bit. I do understand, and again, I think that pointing people in the direction of know that these comments aren't moderated. If you have an official complaint, here's the website link. This is where you go. Here's the DOT page. Here's how you report something to code enforcement. Having the official resource available and still allowing the community conversation. In Mendocino County, we have a special relationship with the government, and our social media pages are not always going to be rainbows and sunshine. And I understand that can be challenging, but at the same time, like I said, I think it really is important that the public's able to provide feedback.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yeah.
So it may help to provide just some of the examples of some of the conversations that we've had and some of the issues that have popped up. So for example, in the sheriff's office front, they found that the feedback was very useful, both just in terms of general feedback and specific information that may be provided through that forum. But the public health was an example of a department that ultimately determined it didn't want to be having the comments on, because one of the issues that was popping up is that they would put out their vaccine announcements, and every time that they would do that, there would be a lot of vaccine misinformation that get posted in the comments, and I have to explain to them, I really don't know that you can go ahead and be deleting the statements that are being made by members of the public with respect to there were a variety of conspiracy theories, but as to bad information about the vaccine. They could post their own responses, but deleting them presents some First Amendment issues. So that was an example of a department that wanted to go ahead and just sort of turn the comments off. I guess one of the questions is with respect to Supervisor Mulheron's comment, there's sort of a few ways that we could potentially do that, right? One would be you could just say that they're all on across the board and then have it be consistent for all of the departments. But then there's also a question of, do you want to give a level of departmental control that essentially each department might have to make a decision as to whether they want that on or off. And then if they do have it on, and you could even have on be sort of the default position, be clear as to what it is that they would do in the event of comments that were violating policies or otherwise raising concerns.
Supervisor, do you want to phrase as a directive?
Yeah, I wanted to just add one more comment, though. I definitely think that an opportunity for each department to look at how they want to do things, and that may change. A department may get an employee that's incredibly adept at social media and want to engage in a manner that's more proactive, or they may lose that employee and want to scale it back. So again, I think being able to use that about section, for instance, on a Facebook or an Instagram page to clearly articulate to the public whether or not a page is monitored is the most efficient way to define what will be happening on an individual department's social media page. So for the directive, were you wanting the departments individually to bring back more information on what their uses would be, or?
I think it would be helpful to get that initial list. I understand it may change, but just as a starting point, which departments want to turn it on which pages and which social media? And is there a cost to it? Do we have adequate resources today? What we don't want to do is have them turn it on and then come back and ask the board for resources to perform the moderation. So I guess I'd like to, I think you're right. It is department by department. And for me, it's a question of, does it provide value to the public, whether being able to be heard or ask questions? In some cases, I'm sure that's true. Other cases, it may just look like another unmoderated forum, and we're going to get supervisors will get a lot of calls about posts that people don't like. And I guess I want to avoid that path, because I can't go to staff and say, hey, would you look at this comment? I have a complaint about it. That we don't have the resources for that. So, and then I guess I would also like the policy to be attached to the individual forums. So if public health decides to turn on comments, the disclaimer about the policy should be on that page, not buried somewhere on the county website, so that the public is clear that they can comment, they can be heard, but they may not get a response.
I can repeat back the motion if you'd like.
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, so direct departments to bring back information on what their uses would be on social media, what the costs are, and whether or not there are adequate resources, and to ensure that the policy for each department is attached to the individual forums and made available to the public.
That works for me. Mo?
Yeah, that works for me as well.
County Council, do you need a motion on this, or is that directive adequate?
I think that's a motion. So we can take a vote if you're ready.
Yep.
Chair Williams, this is CO Angelo. I just want to be clear, given that the next item is on directives, you're, as the General Government Committee, you are giving direction to Chief Counsel Curtis, who has been working on this policy as far as next steps. Is that right? But this
That's
is
correct.
this is not an official board directive. So my apologies for jumping in on this, but I want to be very clear, because this is the next item, that there's a lot of confusion around directives. So you're basically giving Chief Counsel direction on next steps for this policy, but this is not a board directive.
Yeah, Council, does that work for you?
Yes, so this was an item that was referred to the committee by the board. So I think the way I would articulate it is this is clarification as to how to handle the existing item.
And to give direction, we don't need a motion.
I believe that I have sufficient clarification.
Okay. Then let's move on to agenda item 2A, discussion and possible action, including direction to staff regarding 1, define directives, 2, prioritize directives, and 3, review of existing directives issued by the Board of Supervisors. And the sponsor is the Executive Office. CEO, would you like to present?
To Chair Williams. So this item is not only relevant, but timely at this point in time. There has been multiple questions about the directives, certainly questions from the public, questions from retired supervisors, and it's really time that we clarify, please, what the directives are, what the timeframes are, and how we go about. What I would like to start by saying is that all of the departments, of course, have their department priorities. If we look at the planning department, there are certain projects that have moved to the top of the list that has been board direction. And so when there's an item at the board and the board gives a directive that would be specific for the planning department, the issue is that you, the board or the staff, we don't have all of those priorities in front of us. So a directive could be given to the planning department, but they have limited staff and they're working on all these other tasks. And so that directive may not be moved up to the top of the list. So we want to look at the directives, what they are, the purpose of the directives, and the time frame. What's happened in my over a decade sitting here as your CEO is that the directives have become more and more prevalent within the board meetings. And of course, that is your prerogative as the board to give direction, and that's what you do. You develop policy, we implement that policy, you give us direction, and we do it. The challenge that we've had really over the last few years is, I believe, the lack of understanding of what a directive is. For example, let's say that you are in a board meeting and the board decides that they want the Department of Transportation to follow up on a road out in Covelo or something like that. So as long as there's the consensus of the board and then the chair states it as a directive, then we take that as a directive. What's happened repeatedly over the last few years, and it certainly hasn't happened from January 21 on, but before that, what would happen is that a supervisor would come back and say, that was a directive and you haven't recorded it. And so what's happened with that is that clerk staff have had to take their time seriously when they're executing documents and then moving forward with other board meetings, is they've had to take their time and go back and actually listen to that board meeting. And then usually 9 times out of 10, then say to whoever that person is that, no, this was the board direction and there was no directive. So if you understand the confusion that we've had, certainly over the last few years, it's led to some belief that we have all these directives and county staff are not doing these directives. So what will be important and what I'd like us to get out of this session today and clarification is that, define the directive. What do you call a directive? And Nadia Tipton from my office has done a draft of a board directives policy, and we can go to that. And then obviously we need county council to weigh in, but defining the directive and prioritizing. And this is really important because when you give a directive, there's not always a time frame. And so if you gave a directive that you want the Department of Transportation to stop what they're doing and put the road in Covelo as their #1 priority, then that's a directive. And that's the information that we give back to the department. But that's not how the directives work. So clarification on defining the directive, prioritizing the directive, and then also clarifying that when a directive is given, then the chair will say, this is a directive. And then of course, the clerk will usually ask the board, Chair Jurdy or Chair whoever, is that a directive? And the reason we do that is because of exactly what I said. We've had cases where supervisors have come back and said, there was a directive and you missed it. And then we go back, a couple hours, listen to the whole meeting, and there was no directive. So it's really important that those steps are taken. So with that, what I'd like to do is have our clerks, have Senior Clerk Lindsay Doherty and also Atlas Pearson just weigh in, because they're the ones who are recording these directives during the meeting, trying to get clarification and trying to understand what the board is actually asking. So if I can go to Lindsay.
Yeah, just before we do, I thought I saw the supervisor's hand up.
Oh, okay.
The clerks can speak, but I have a couple of ideas. And so I, one of the things I think that needs to be very clear for the clerk's office is that one board member does not provide directives on their own. And so if we need to include in the purpose and definition the way that a board member can seek clarification on a directive, then I think that that is important. So I was just prepared to go over that particular document, but if the clerks would like to provide their feedback first, I'm perfectly fine with that.
This is Deputy Clerk Lindsay Doherty. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. There has been confusion around directives since I began clerking with this board. And I think what would be most beneficial today, outside of detail in terms of how it's captured, would be a very straightforward definition of directives and how they are recorded. And then also some direction on how the clerk can affirm or follow up to confirm that it's a directive, or maybe even what the chair can do to help confirm that it's a directive. There's a lot of confusion around that, and it can lead to serious miscommunication, and we want the record to be accurate always.
So could you clarify the agenda? I see 1, define directives. I think that relates to the draft document. And
Yes.
then 2 is prioritize directives, but 3 is review of existing directives issued by the Board of Supervisors.
Yes.
What's the difference between 2 and 3?
What we have is that we need to know as part of the definition what you would consider a priority, or that as you give a directive, you tell us what the priority is. So basically you would say, we want this directive, we want this brought back to the board in 30 days or in 60 days. And that doesn't happen. So that would be the prioritization. And then the existing directives issued by the board as attached to this item, Nadia Tipton has organized all the directives. And so we would like this process dealt with first, and then we could go through the directives if that's what the General Government Committee would like.
Okay,
So,
Supervisor, do you concur?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay, so let's start with 1, define directives in this draft document.
So,
Oh, go ahead.
okay. All right, so what I'd like to do is go to Nadia, who put this together, and then if Christian has comments on this document. Again, this is a draft, this is a starting point, and I'll have Nadia go through it. Nadia, you don't have to read it word for word, but if you can define or just speak to the key points of this directive policy, please.
Good morning, Nadia Tipton, Executive Office. I put together this draft stating the purpose and the definition of directives. We break them down into how we record directives during the meeting, how the clerk captures those directives. We've got general consensus of the board, which we would need to see or hear a unanimous agreement of the full board to record that directive. Those directives get recorded, they're put in our minutes, and we also have a separate tracker that we keep so that we can maintain, follow up with our departments. And then the chair can also give a directive by order of the chair that's under his powers. So what we really want to see is probably an expansion of item number 1 under definition. I don't believe that we always see or hear a unanimous agreement of the full board, and we would like to call that policy out, what we need to do during the meeting in order to stop and record that directive before moving forward to the next item. So I believe that's what we're looking for today. And if you have any changes you'd like to make to this today, I'd be more than happy to do that with you now.
Mulhern, do you have any changes you'd like to see, or are you happy with the document?
No, I don't believe that we are always going to have a unanimous vote on directives. So I think that's priority 1 as part of this conversation. Consensus is fine with me, because we may not have all board members agreeing that that's a directive. So I'm happy to hear from County Council and yourself, Chair.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Please.
So just my own observation, I think there's been a few, I first of all, I very much agree with the clerk of the board and the executive office with respect to the concerns related to directives. I think one of the things that so first of all, I think what we're reciting here is something that has been akin to past practice. I do want to just highlight you do have more options available. So for example, you could decide that you would only act by motion or other mechanisms. I think one of the things that I just want to highlight is that there's been ambiguity as to what is and is not a directive. I think there's also been ambiguity as to what the directives are. In particular, if there's a complex subject and the ultimate directive ends up being, relatively brief in its description. I've often found that there may be points that are raised during the discussion that it's sort of hard to know, whether one supervisor's comments as to, I think we should do it this way or that way, was incorporated into the final directive or not. And then there are often situations in which it's sort of a little bit difficult to because it's not necessarily included in the directive as stated. It can be difficult to sort of figure out, exactly how much is intended by the full board to be part of what staff should be doing. So I had thrown out this idea before that, one option would be, not to volunteer work for a clerk of the board, but one option would be that all the directives could come back on consent to the next meeting and be voted on, unless any member thinks that there's an issue with the wording or that something should have been included in the directive that wasn't, similar to the way that the minutes are approved. And that way the board would have an opportunity to discuss and make changes if there was any disagreement as to how the directive was phrased. One option would be to have a motion for everything. But I think one of the most important things is just having a clear distinction between what is the direction and action of the full board versus what are the comments that went into that discussion leading up to it.
So I agree with everything you said, but it sounds like the board should do a better job articulating and capturing direction so that staff isn't later confused. And I don't know that a policy, we can make a policy, but it's really on us as a board to not give vague, ambiguous direction.
So Chair Williams, CEO Angelo here, I think that, I think we're all on the same page here. What I would like to see is that, we continue with the clarification. I think Nadia has done a good job, a good start of putting this together, and certainly we can make changes and bring it back to general government next month. But I think that the clearest way to get there is for the chair to clarify in the meeting that, this is a directive, here's the time frame, and go from there. And then the clerk have that. Regarding bringing it back to vote, I would prefer we don't do that. You have 3 clerk staff. And in the olden days, let me say, before we were consolidated, you had 5 to 6 clerk staff. But that was before we had all the electronic records and Granicus and everything that we have today. There are some counties that are our size that have 1 to 2. So we're actually doing well to have 3 very good and fairly experienced staff. I don't want us to have this particular staff that are always working on a board meeting have to bring something back. What we've done is we've put the directives on the CEO report. So once a month, you get the CEO report and you get a copy of those directives. And if we haven't updated, those directives are updated. Yep. So I prefer actually when I do the CEO report, highlighting the directives are there. Does anyone have any questions? Are there any changes? Did we miss something? Rather than having the action of having to have the clerks bring them back, if that's okay with this.
Understood. Supervisor?
Yeah, I believe that the CEO's report is an appropriate place to have the directives. I would like for that to be spelled out in this policy document so that individual supervisors don't come to our team members and ask why something has or has not been done. I also think that there is no harm in requiring that it be a formal motion so that we can have a vote. Again, not a unanimous vote, but a consensus vote on what the direction is. And then it's up to the individual supervisors to make sure that when they're reading the CEO report, the direction is what they thought it was. And if it's not, then they need to bring it up in a board meeting.
Council?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to note that I agree with everything Supervisor Mulhern just said. I was just going to note that for one of the things that the chair had mentioned was that, you know, part of it is getting the articulation of the directive correct, but I think part of this is also making sure that there's a record keeping process that everyone can be familiar with, so that staff don't have to go back and look at the audio anytime there's any uncertainty, that there's sort of a clarity as to what the final action is, and that is captured. So I think as long as it was in the CEO report, and as long as the policy sort of reflected that was the mechanism and that was the opportunity to bring up clarifications or changes to directive, that would, I think that would work quite well. I think part of the key is having a policy document that sort of refers the board to that as the place to make that comment or to address that issue.
Okay, I can support the document, Supervisor.
I see the clerk of the board's hand raised, and
Yes, this is Deputy Clerk Lindsay Doherty again, and I just want to volunteer that we've been working really hard to ensure that minutes come back on the next subsequent agenda. And on those minutes, you can always find the directives and the motions written out as they're captured for the record. So they're there, and they actually are voted on, and we would continue doing that. Even in the event that we only took directives in a motion, that would continue there too. So there is a way to affirm what's been taken on the subsequent agenda.
I want to clarify the definition of 1A.
Go for it.
Unanimity versus consensus. And I think maybe if we could, I don't know if we need to strike the first unanimous and just add it or change it to consensus, or what we need to do to specifically change that.
No, is Nadia available to answer why she went with unanimous in 1A?
Nadia Tipton, Executive Office. Typically, we have a unanimous consensus during the board meetings when we record these. If it's 3-2, we normally would not record it as a directive. So we're looking for either to the chair or a verbal agreement of all supervisors. So if you would like to strike or change the language, we can do that, and we can bring this back to the committee next month.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I just note that I have had one supervisor in the past suggest that consensus implies unanimity. So if you don't want to make it unanimous, you may want to just use a different word there.
So 1 could be general agreement of the board, and 1A would be upon hearing majority. Yeah, Supervisor, would you agree to make this change?
I believe that it should say majority. You've been on the board a little bit longer than me, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts about that. But I think that there is sometimes direction provided without all 5 supervisors in agreement.
Yeah, so I do agree. So my understanding is this will come back with the changes.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Can we also clarify the process with which supervisor has a question about the directive, in which way they can bring that up? We've mentioned the CEO report. We've mentioned that it's in the minutes, and I would like for this document to clarify that, to alleviate individual supervisors directly. I don't want to say the wrong word, but directly going to staff. I would like for that clarification to come during a board meeting. So.
Yeah. So there are a number of cases where I've asked staff one-on-one, what is the status on blank? And I find it valuable so that we don't use that board time, and it's higher bandwidth conversation than we can justify during an open session. But I've been careful to never ask to reprioritize or change the direction staff is going. I'm one supervisor. I don't have that authority, but I think it is helpful to be able to query one-on-one.
I agree with that, but if a former supervisor is continuing to direct staff based on directives that were from the past, I think that there's, a ship has sailed. So I also, would like to have some type of definition to clarify that process.
Got it. I missed the distinction there. CEO, can you tell us, do we have a former supervisor who's querying staff about past directives?
Chair Williams, we have a former supervisor who consistently communicates with county staff at his leisure, so at their leisure. So am I part of those calls, emails, whatever? No. But we are led to believe that does continue to happen.
And is this the type of communication that any member of the public would have with clerk of board?
Actually, it's the departments, not the clerk staff. So remember, because the directives go out to the departments, and particularly around cannabis, there's been multiple directives around cannabis. So usually members of the public aren't that familiar with directives, whether it's a correct directive or an inaccurate directive. So it is unusual to have a sixth supervisor attempting to direct staff. That is unusual, yes. So we could put something, we certainly could put something in our policy here that would speak to one, we're talking about consensus. We're talking about the chair actually confirming that something's a directive. And we could come up with some language with the help of our chief counsel that would not be offensive, but would be very clear that the directives come from the current board of supervisors.
Yeah, so I guess I can support that, but I think it's inherent in the existing structure. There are 5 supervisors, not 5.5. So yeah. I didn't know that this was going on, and I think staff today could stop it. Direct those kind of inquiries to public expression at our meeting.
I agree with you, Chair Williams. We have 1,200 staff. Most of them are very nice and courteous and attempt to answer questions. And particularly when we have a retired supervisor, we do give them the deference that we think that they deserve. And so I think that happens certainly in our departments. But anyway, I agree. I think we're all attempting to do a really good job in clarification here. So yes.
As a retired supervisor, the deference that I would deserve is the same as any other member of the public.
Well, Chair Williams, when you retire, we'll remember that. But I assure you, you will get the respect and the deference of a retired supervisor, as we have done for many years in this county. Thank you.
So Supervisor, can you agree with these changes, understanding that the draft will come back for further review?
Yes.
Okay, then let's move on to prioritize directives.
Thank you. So mainly what we would do is put it in our policy here that when the board gives a directive, that they also give us a time frame. And, that's a difficult one because, if you give us 5 directives in a meeting and it's all a time frame of 30 days, it does make it difficult. But we do need that because some directives, particularly some of the cannabis directives, they were out there for a couple years. So that's the only thing we want there, is giving us a time frame on the directives. And as far as prioritizing, there are some things, we know this, that on each agenda, there are some urgent items that come up. So it's quite possible that if it's planning or DOT and they have this list of priority projects, that there's another project that comes up that's more of a priority. So I think, again, just a time frame that the board would give us, that's the prioritization. And if it's something, I'll use the Potter Valley project for one. We know that there's movement on the Potter Valley project and there may be some activities that need to be done. That's nothing that we've had in the water agency or DOT, or planning that's been a priority. So if something like that came up, you would also say that you would tell the clerk staff to make sure that the department understands this is a 30-day time frame and that this is a priority of the board. And there are many times that when we give the information to a department when we go back and tell them what the directive is, because not all department heads are sitting there, listening to the board meetings, we will say, this is a high priority for the Board of Supervisors. So you need to put this to the top of the list.
Right. And so do you believe that it's better to rank based on time? Or would it be better for the board to tell you where to insert it in a ranked list? So, we agree it's number 54, inserted in that position. And I guess I see merit in both, which is easier for staff to regularly parse and update.
I think it's easier for staff and for the board if you just say, we want this back to the board in 60 days. And then we'll go back to the department. If the department head says, it's going to take 90 days, then we would get that information back to the board. But I think just giving a time frame would be good.
Can we add a column to the process directives with the date the item will come back, with an understanding of if it's not complete, it'll come back for an update?
Yes, absolutely.
Supervisor?
Do that, right?
Yes.
I think that because some of the in-process directives are actually several years old, it would also be helpful if, I don't know how the department heads receive this information. If they're receiving this from the board meetings, or if it would be more appropriate to sort it based on department, and individual departments would then review that and look for their items and make sure that they're checking off their boxes. I'm sure you've probably tried it several ways, and each individual department head would prefer it to be received differently. But for me, sorted by department would add more clarity as to whose ball is in which court.
So
This is Nadia Tipton, Executive Office, if I may. We do filter this spreadsheet that we keep of the board directives by department. And what I'll do every so often when I'm going to bring updates forward on the CEO report, we'll filter that by department and send it to appropriate department heads. If there's multiple departments listed on a directive, we'll send it to those departments for input and any updates or comments they may have. And that happens probably bi-monthly. If we want to add a definition in our policy document of how this information goes out to those departments, we can certainly do that.
Supervisor?
I think that checking in on the directives at a department head's annual review should be something that would at least hold them more accountable. Obviously, if it's received and it's public information, that is one step. But if a department head is not regularly updating the board with where their directives are in the process, then that should be included as part of their review.
I agree with that. And let's incorporate that as direction today, that we would like the status of directives and issuance date and completion date reviewed at the department head's annual review. And then I have a question for staff. What is the county's software for tracking? It certainly isn't a spreadsheet. Is there a tool that provides reminders and provides a whole history of what's been done? For example, when I look at Directive D99, it's the last item in that in the attachment, the process directives. It was sponsored by me, incidentally, and I felt pretty good about it. And this was back on September 17th of 2019. I look in the progress updates and there's nothing. Is it true that nothing has been done? Or what software tool tracks all of the effort to date, the time, who's worked on it, how it's progressed?
So, Mr. Chair, I can speak to that as to this item. The ordinance is drafted. The item is ready to go. That one had been bumped a few times. It was on hold during some of the COVID emergency.
Yeah. So I'm not asking about the status of the item so much as in the abstract. Where, as a supervisor, where would I go to learn who's worked on it? Like, you put in 6 hours and then it went to clerk and she put in some time. Where is that trail? What software do we use to track?
I don't
It's
know.
an executive office. The current process for our directives, we enter them into a simple Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, so is it possible for us to change that process? One of the glaring problems I see in Mendocino County's government is we're using the wrong tools. A spreadsheet is a really loose way to track this data. You know, if you were doing software development, you'd use a tool like Jira that would show you who it's assigned to, who's worked on it, how it's shifted from being assigned to one department to another, where it's blocked dependencies. And we're missing all of that. So we just don't, supervisors, and probably the CEO, I think, doesn't have any visibility into work that's underway. And, you know, I look at this and assume it's stuck somewhere, it's being worked on. There's other priorities, but I would sure like to see who it's assigned to and how much work has gone into it and why it's blocked. Is it possible with this update to evaluate the appropriate tools for tracking?
Yeah, Chair Williams, we will do that. We have utilized the Excel spreadsheet for years. And quite honestly, over the last few years, the directives have increased. Before then, the staff really didn't get as many directives out of the board meeting. So it's actually ramped up. So we will go ahead and look at software packages between the clerk of the board and Nadia in my office, and then we'll bring that back. And then obviously, just like we do with our other software packages, whether it's OpenGov or any of the others where the public can access them, whether it's the PRAs or our finance information, the public can access all of our finance information on our website. It sounds to me like you may be thinking that this could be even a public document, which I don't think is unreasonable.
Yeah, and it would alleviate the problem of a former supervisor to call to check on the status of an item. And I mean, I don't think that's ideal use of staff time, but I can understand if an item has been sitting without any update for a year, people are wondering what's happening. Is it moving or is it forgotten? Is it vetoed? And a spreadsheet in 2021 is like using a chalkboard to track status of directives.
Well,
So
sometimes we are in a time warp up here. We
Yeah.
have a system that planning uses, a track it system. We'll look at that first to see if that would be appropriate. But whatever we do, we will bring it back to general government for your input and direction.
Okay. Supervisor, are you ready to move on to 3, review of existing directives issued by the board?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Nadia. And then if Lindsay or Atlas have anything further to say, they can speak after we go through this. But so Nadia, if you want to walk us through the directives, that would be great.
Nadia Tipton, Executive Office. So attached to this item, you have a list of completed directives, and then you have a list of in-process directives that have progress or updates that we have received from individual departments. We have informed departments that they may be needed for any questions or clarification you might seek today. But if you want to walk through these and give any sort of update or direction today, we can certainly do that.
So can we talk about process before we begin? I don't think the 2 supervisors can give, as the committee, I don't think we can give direction to change the priority. And we certainly can't halt any of the directives. So at most, I think we could give a recommendation to bring back to the full board. Council, do you agree?
Yes. So what you could do is compile a list that you would have of recommendations of, ones that could be altered or modified or in any way that may be appropriate.
Okay. And are we aiming to put together a ranked list or deadlines? Or are we simply looking for stale items to cross out?
So Chair Williams, because there's been so much attention to the directives, we thought we would bring them forward, and you and Supervisor Mulheron could determine how you want to proceed. And I agree, there are multiple directives. You could make recommendations that we could then give to the full board. But I think that there's been tremendous clarification here today so far. So what you might want to do is just, if you've had time to look at this, just highlight those directives that either you or Supervisor Mulheron see as an issue or something you'd like to revisit today. Other than that, I don't know that you, because you're right, you can't give direction to us on those. We're not going to change the priority. We're not going to do anything like that. So.
And I guess I'm concerned that, like that last item, D99, it doesn't have any progress or updates. Does it make sense for staff to go iterate through this list first, remove the items that have been completed and update status, or do you want to do it in real time together?
We can certainly do that if you'd like to today. We can call on departments that these are assigned to give us any updates if they're available. I wouldn't particularly have insight as to what progress departments have made unless they've contacted me with an update. So that's why those remain without anything written.
Yeah, so I guess it strikes me as premature that if we go through all of these items, and we should, we're going to ask questions which we don't have answers to today. Would it be better to send this out to the departments, ask that they bring us up to date, and come back to look at that document so that we're not discussing items that have already been completed and not updated?
So Chair Williams, you bring up a good point, and I think it's similar to what we did with contracts. If you recall that we had different departments come into general government. This was before January, and then I'm not certain what you did this year, but different departments came in and went through their contracts, and you had the opportunity to actually do one-on-one with the department. And so maybe we'll handle this differently. I mean, you see everything here that we have. I think that we can go back to the departments, let them know that these directives are again going to general government in January, and that, they must give us their update. And then we'll have a clear understanding as to what's done and what's not. Would you like to proceed like that?
Yeah, I want to go to supervisor first.
I'm fine with having the departments review the directives and bring them back in January. I think one of the things that could alleviate some of the items on this list, we could look at 2218, which makes up about 25% of this list and probably can all be removed. But additionally, when the directive is, for instance, item directive 2121, and it's for the cannabis staff to provide regular reports. Well, that is happening within the CEO's report. So does it need to remain? This is a question for the chair and county council. Does it need to remain on this directives list, or is that something that the board gave direction and it's happening, so we take it off the list and we move on? We don't want it to fall off of the CEO's report. So, somebody has to have some kind of historical record that the board did direct that to go back to, but it doesn't need to be in this document ongoing, in my opinion.
I agree. So the directive was to implement it. It's been implemented. The item can be closed. It's like my grocery list. I don't just build on it indefinitely. If I buy the item on the list, I cross it out. I don't think we're crossing out items as they're completed. And I don't think we have the right people on this meeting to know what to cross out. So I would like to send this back to the individual departments and ask that they update every single item and tell us the current status as of December 2021. Either it's complete or how much work has gone into it and what remains.
Okay, Chair Williams, we could do that, and we can do that, and we can be ready in January. I do have to say, though, that we attempt to close out items at the end of the year. We do that with ad hocs and items that go to standing committee. And unfortunately, since you will be, I don't believe that you will be on general government next year. I could be wrong, but providing your chair next year, usually the chair doesn't sit on the committees. So that's the only thing I would say, that there may be two different or one different supervisor next year. I just have to say that. But we will go ahead and do what you said. I also want to say, in fairness to the department heads, that they do get the list of directives, that it's not, we don't hold this list and not give it to them. We do. But I think what happens is that the directives don't come in as a priority in the departments, because the departments have their activities that they do. So we will go ahead and send this out, make sure that the department heads know that this is a priority. We need the information for the January general government meeting, and then we can go.
And CEO, can we treat this as a one-time effort, finish wrapping up this spreadsheet? while we transition to soft tracking software. Maybe it's Track It, maybe it's a different tool. That way, department heads can enter status as it changes. Supervisors, staff, and the public can all watch that live.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. And I really do want to thank you and Supervisor Mulheron. We've gotten more direction on these directives than I've gotten in 14 years. So thank you very much for that.
Council, go ahead.
Oh, just two things, Mr. Chair. One is I did want to say, in fairness to the executive office, I do believe that they sent out and requested for updates on the directives. I will say, I am behind on that, and I see some other departments are as well. So we will get that done, and we will get you the feedback on those. But then the other thing was, you mentioned possibly taking things off the list that were ongoing. For staff's purposes, I do find that in particular directives that came before my time, I have found that there have been a history of board directives to sort of always do this, never do that aren't found in policy documents. And if the board wants to sort of consistently do that, it may be appropriate to have some sort of document tracking those. So for example, the whole add delete convention, I think the board has decided to get away from that. But there had been direction from the board previously that we would never add a position without deleting a position. And that's not something that, I would know unless someone told me what the prior board direction had been on that front.
And we might not even follow it. So it seems silly to have it as a directive from a past board to current board.
So we have, as I said, we've received good direction on this item. I think that the transitioning to a software program, Track It or something similar, will be good. The follow-up with the department heads, will also follow up with them in our next department head meeting. I think that as far as the one pager that Nadia put together, she will make those changes. Once we have the changes made in a draft form, we will run those by Chief Counsel Curtis before we bring them back to general government. And unless Lindsay or Atlas have anything to add, or Chair Williams or Supervisor Mulheron.
Do we have any public comment on this item?
We do not.
Any final comments before we move on? I think direction was given.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation.
Okay, well, moving on to the next item, 2C, discussion and possible action, including direction regarding the development of Mendocino County's 2022 legislative platform, and the sponsor is the executive office.
So Chair Williams, we have Deputy CEO Judy Morris on. She is our legislative deputy, and she has been working with the board as she can to put this agenda item together. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Deputy CEO Morris.
Thank you, CEO Angelo. Good morning, Supervisor Williams and Mulheron. As it was pointed out, this is, as you know, this is also an annual activity that you and ultimately the board reviews and recommends and adopts. This is based on our county policy 19, and it does come up every year. As you might recall, department heads are tasked with suggesting upcoming legislation that we should be monitoring, perhaps supporting, advocating for. So many of the changes that you have seen in this draft platform are a result of some input from a variety of departments. I also have suggested a couple legislative activities that we might look to have happen next year, or that I hear is coming down next year, and we just need to have our ears and eyes open to be able to respond. So with that, I don't know how you'd like to review this. I was thinking of going department by department, if that works for all of you, or if you would like to take it another direction in terms of any additions, deletions you'd like to suggest.
Supervisor, do you have any preference?
I do not.
So I read it. I mean, I'm happy if you want to work through it for staff and public. We could go through line by line. I'm also fine just jumping to any questions or comments.
Right, you have in front of you, as does the public, the red line version. So probably for really the public's sake too, I think it would be really informative. We can quickly go through some of the deletions and additions. I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
We'll start with disaster recovery, preparedness, and resiliency. On page 7, you'll see some additions where it's suggested that we advocate and support for state protection for homeowners insurance availability and affordability in fire-prone areas. Actually, that could almost be in part of economic development. Bullet 2, right below that, we have support funding for wildfire prevention, including the development and or improvement of second access roads and emergency egress for communities in the wildland urban interface. That we're going to see a lot, I think, legislation on wildfire prevention in general. In rural areas, this has become a theme. So those are 2 under the state action that is listed there. And then I'll just keep moving through this until either one of you want to jump in, if that works.
That works.
Okay. And then, of course, moving on to COVID-19 response and recovery. We did take out one bullet that was really not applicable at this point. Further down, we also took out the reference to Great Plates. That program has fulfilled its mission, is my understanding. And we also put in the need for economic development, any funding that would come through under COVID-19. That would be under state action. Moving on to page 8, under federal action, there is certainly talk. Congress has yet to adopt, although it is in the works. We want to certainly advocate for support of additional flexibility for the American Rescue Plan Act. Counties are certainly need a little more flexibility in how they issue out a variety of funding for a variety of programs to a variety of entities. And so this is the need for some flexibility with that act. Further down on page 8, under natural resources, we have support state funding. This is a new added addition. Support state funding for implementation of groundwater sustainable plans, known as GSP. We also listed advocate for recycling and organic waste reduction legislation that take into account the needs of rural communities. Also support state funding for drought response infrastructure to facilitate water resiliency in rural communities. And lastly, support state funding, very much the same coin here, for flood response and infrastructure. As we've seen many times in rural areas, drought happens, and then of course, winter arrives and we have many times floods that follow, including post-wildfire debris. So this is support additional funding for those efforts. Moving on to page 9. We also, under natural resources, listed advocate for legislation that would address the formation of a governing authority for the Potter Valley project. Right below that, you'll see advocate for state funding to assist the Inland Water and Power Commission and planning agreement parties in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, known as FERC, relicensing process for the Potter Valley project. Under federal action, under natural resources, we reference the FERC process again, also with a little bit more of a blanket statement of other related items to achieve Mendocino County's goals. And at below federal action, we emphasize the point to engage with United States Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and other federal land management agencies to ensure that local communities are consulted regarding the land management issues regarding recreation, fire management, and law enforcement. Moving to page 9, you'll see we're still on page 9, my apologies, economic and community development. Then moving on to page 10. Under state action, we have listed, of course, broadband deployment, a little bit more detail regarding, there's a lot of money out there and we just want to make sure in case upcoming legislation refines the existing allocation of money that we have it on our radar. Of course, the traditional support dig once, trench once legislation and other policies which streamline the deployment of conduit for underground fiber optic, electrical cables, minimize regulatory burdens and permitting processes for deployment of internet connectivity. Advocate to maximize broadband infrastructure investment and equitable county-wide connectivity from the delivery of the middle and last mile projects under SB 156 and other state and federal funds. Support and monitor
Sorry, Judy, can you pause for a moment? I see
absolutely. Sure.
Supervisor Mulhern has her hand up.
Thank you. I was reading, so I'm glad you caught that. Oops.
Sorry, it's fine. It's fine if you want to go ahead and continue. I have concerns about this section really limiting our abilities for other technologies other than fiber. I think that it should include other technologies such as satellites. I don't know what else is going to come in the future. It just feels very focused and very limiting.
Sure, and I think really that really has developed out of the recent flow of funding for this topic. Certainly doesn't mean to exclude other applications, and we can certainly address that.
Can we incorporate it into the language?
Absolutely.
I think it might have been inherent that we support all technology that'll move the needle. But I think Supervisor Mulhern is right. It would be good to spell out that that we're not advocating for any one type specific solution.
In order of time, I'm really making notes on wireless, satellite, those applications, unless you have some more additional language you'd like to specifically.
No, I think that covers it. Does that work for you, Supervisor?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, let's go on. Let's move on.
Okay. So page 10, would you like me to finish the broadband language?
Yes.
Okay. So again, we have support and monitor the development and deployment of a robust county-wide middle mile open access fiber backbone to enhance economic development, stimulate affordable broadband availability to all homes, businesses, schools, libraries, public safety facilities, health services, and other institutions throughout Mendocino County. Of course, it is inherent, but this really is in reference to the RCRC project. Doesn't mean there couldn't be another interested party on middle mile.
So there's one idea I'd like to offer. We don't need to get the specific language today, but the county, historically, all counties were in a position to enter into agreements with internet providers, information services providers. And a lot of counties would include an anti-cherry picking clause. In essence, the provider would commit to serving the whole community and not come through picking up the most profitable, skipping over the others that no other provider could come in behind and cover. And those agreements seem to have transitioned from county level to state, arguably under the CPUC. But it doesn't appear the CPUC has the necessary authority or follow through to ensure anti-cherry picking. So this wouldn't be advocating for funds. It would be advocating for policy, whether at a local level or state level, to ensure that providers either cover entire communities or allow another provider to cover the entire community, but not take the most profitable, leaving the remainder unserved.
Completely understand, and it is certainly a policy that I don't believe has had a lot of attention in general. So I've made some notes on that, and I will need to dig a little bit further into what exists out there. If that works for you, Supervisor.
That works.
Okay. Last bullet point under state action is advocate and facilitate the complete and accurate broadband connectivity data needed for smart policy and design decisions required to effectively bridge the growing digital divide. So any other questions on any broadband related subject?
No.
I don't have any others.
All right. Then you'll see federal action very similarly marries the state action. I will look at the federal through the federal lens on the points that all of you have made as well. And moving on to Health and Human Services, you'll see in the second bullet point, staff has recommended that we add child welfare services and take out fatality case notifications. In bullet point 4, we support additional funding and programs that provide improved access to local mental health services, including increased and consistent funding for mental health housing programs, crisis support, and jail diversion programs and services for foster youth and complex needs. The last part of that sentence, as you'll see on your copy, was added. And the last 2 bullet points are new, and that is to support funding incentives for homeless providers who develop and implement meaningful and integrated workforce development programs. And the following bullet also is to support funding for small business wage subsidies to hire homeless and recently homeless individuals. Okay, with that, I will move on to page 11 and 12, actually, to public safety. You'll see at the first paragraph for public safety, the last sentence is, we firmly oppose future and further unfunded state mandates. I think you'd see that as a universal concern, especially for rural counties. Under state action, you'll see under bullet point 2, support additional state funding for the sheriff's office, probation, public defender, and district attorney to implement money bail reform. And then it was added as it relates to the Humphrey decision and the bills like SB 262. Further down, we did some editing as recommended by the department. Support additional permanent and stable state backfill to cover county's revenue loss resulting from AB 1869 and recent removal of criminal justice fines, fees, and penalties by the legislature. Right below that, you'll see in red the support permanent, stable, and consistent funding of SB 678 in light of AB 1950. And lastly, the last bullet point, oppose any additional state efforts to change criminal justice fines, fees, and penalties without providing corresponding revenue backfill. And again, the language added that is permanent and stable. Moving on to page 13 under cannabis. So there's a bit of, you'll see the first bullet point was eliminated, deleted. In terms of being having some reference to current situation. Bullet point 2, advocate for the elimination of the state cultivation tax as a means to support the economic recovery of small business and quell competition with the illicit market. Bullet point 3, advocate in support of California Advisory Committee CAC recommendation to eliminate project-specific CEQA analysis as an annual licensing requirement and support the Department of Cannabis Control of DCC, of course, in providing recommendations to local jurisdictions identifying how CEQA compliance can be accomplished during the local permitting process. Bullet point 3, advocate for the California Department of Cannabis Control, known as DCC, to accept CEQA compliance pathways set forth by local jurisdiction. including pathways that provide ministerial permits and principally permit cannabis operations without requiring additional project-specific analysis of the operations before qualifying for a state annual license. Bullet point 4 remains from the previous year, advocate for the removal of the 4-acre cap on cannabis cooperative associations to allow economy of scale for small farmers. Bullet point 5, what one, two? I'm sorry, 7, where I'm support advocate for state regulatory policy changes that facilitate opportunities for cultivators, processors, and manufacturers to engage in direct consumer sales. And then at the bottom, the last statement was eliminated from from last year's version. Support the efforts at the state level to allow for and make available banking and other financial services to cannabis operators in order to minimize the use of cash. On the federal side, there's certainly additional effort. That same subject matter of banking and cash is also under federal action, which really does need to come from the feds on this. And there is some efforts currently going on. It was just this last week, they put a provision in the Defense Act, which I understand has been taken out. And along with, I probably will know by the next time we meet in January where that legislation for federal banking actually resides. Also at the Fed level, descheduling and regulatory development is in discussions at the federal legislation level. So that wraps up the changes from last year's version. You'll see, of course, we have added Senator Padilla as our senator from last year, as he was appointed by our governor after Senator Harris moved to the White House. So with that, any other questions, comments, additions, deletions?
Yeah, we have correspondence from MCA regarding cannabis policy. Does staff or Supervisor Mulhern have any issue with any of those recommendations before we go to public comment? I'm wondering if we could just copy and paste their entire list. Supervisor?
I can wait to hear from staff, and I will.
I think Kristen is available.
Okay, I mean, it would be great to hear from Kristen. I think that there was at least a couple of them that I thought the full board should consider before moving in that direction. And just in my notes for this item, and I had advocating for tax credits at both the state and federal level. And, you know, perhaps before legalization happens at a federal level, there is some advocacy work that we could do regarding 1080E and taxes so that cultivators can truly write off their business expenses just as any other business would. So those were a couple of the notes that I had before going into the MCA memo.
Supervisor Mulhern, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. I certainly understand and the 1080E situation, and there was, you had mentioned tax credits for both at the state and federal level. Did I capture that correctly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So just a question for staff, matter of process. Do you want to go through the MCA memo item by item and decide today? Or does staff want to make a pass at incorporating the MCA memo into our legislative platform and bring it back?
I think I would appreciate the direction from the governance committee on the MCA memo before incorporating those items, if at all possible.
Kristen, do you want to go item by item and get a thumbs up on what to incorporate?
Sure. And some items, just to be clear, I did not incorporate because they're regulatory actions, and I was unsure if the board wanted regulatory actions included in the ledge platform as well. So as I go through,
let's answer that before we go on. I
Okay.
would say yes, Supervisor Mulhern.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Answered.
Okay, fabulous. So the first recommendation is to advocate that cannabis be treated as an agricultural crop, and cannabis cultivation on farm, drying, trimming, processing, and packaging as an agricultural activity, and moving the regulatory components or language that creates or establishes the regulations and statute from Business and Professions Code to California Food and Agriculture Code. So that's what's embodied in item 1. The movement of regulations from BMP code to California Food and Agriculture Code would have to be a legislative action.
Mhm.
However, the ability to treat cannabis or define cannabis cultivation as an agricultural crop is a regulatory action.
All right. So I would support 1. Super Mulhern.
Agreed. And the board has previously provided direction that we want
Yeah.
cannabis treated as an agricultural crop. So
Okay.
Staff have any issue incorporated in 1?
No, but I'd like to do it, if I may, as 2 separate items so we can
Mhm.
differentiate the regulatory component from the legislative component. Would that be?
I think on all of these items, if we give a thumbs up, it's your discretion how to incorporate it, split it up, reword it, but take the general intent and try to find a way to include it in the legislative platform.
Okay. Thank you for that. Number 2, advocate for the inclusion of licensed cannabis business to access specifically state-funded disaster relief and grant programs to non-cannabis businesses. So I think this might need to go in the state and federal action area. I realize that MCA is talking about state-funded disaster relief programs. However, they are largely funded, it's my understanding, by federal monies. So it may need to be mentioned both in state and.
So I support it, and you can decide where it belongs. Supervisor Mulhern, do you concur?
agree.
Okay, let's move on to 3.
Okay.
Direct sales for small farms. I support it.
It is included in there. So we could expand it to include references to farm sales, farmers markets, and direct delivery. But currently in the platform, there is broad language supporting consumer direct sales for farms. That doesn't necessarily narrow it to these specific types of direct sales.
And I don't know that it'll have an impact, but I'm also not against including it for clarity. Supervisor?
I think it's fine to include those items for clarity and then offer any other types of opportunities as well.
So Frey says not limited to.
Okay.
Yeah, these are just frequently asked questions, and having the board support those items explicitly, I think, might be helpful to the community to understand. And then, of course, we don't want to narrow our options. So having a more broad item would also be helpful.
So 4 mix and match license types.
Yes, this again, regulatory action, and I think has a lot to do with, say, the inability for cultivators to conduct outdoor cultivation in a mixed light tier 1 type license under the state, therefore forcing folks into 2 licenses. So this is a regulatory action, but definitely see the need for it.
Supervisor, do you support it?
Support.
Okay. 5 cannabis taxes.
Yes, we have included a request for removal of or elimination of the cultivation tax. I am unclear what the second item is. It was not discussed when we met with the groups. So retail sales should be based on net sales, not gross receipts. I really don't understand what they're asking for here. So I'll just turn it
So it
back
sounds like
over.
5 cannabis taxes is already incorporated. I'm sure MCA is watching. They can provide clarification on what's meant in the second bullet. 6, cottage industry.
Cottage industry. So there has been a request specifically for the cottage industry codes that are already active in California to apply to cannabis. However, this is not necessarily going to be applicable unless there's a regulatory action to eliminate the prohibition on activities inside a residence. So currently, cultivation activities can happen as part of a residential structure, but no other activities are included within a residence. And so a lot of what is required for something like this to move forward is the use of a household kitchen, say for making salves, tinctures, and other cottage industry type products. So potentially rewording this to request that the regulatory agencies remove the restriction of activities within a residence, and then second, clarify that the cottage industry codes may be applicable. But on its own, it would not, I don't believe, accomplish the goal.
Yeah, so I support it with the modifications at your discretion. Supervisor, do you concur?
I do.
Okay, 7, building code.
Building code, to be honest with you, I found this a little intimidating to tackle. Requesting that the state's building code be reformed to allow activities with no employees. And then I'm also, I don't believe currently, if you have no employees, you can conduct trimming in an F1 building. So I think I'm a little unclear on this one as well. If we're asking, yes.
I think they want to advocate for allowing cannabis trimming and processing in structures that are not F1.
With employees?
I would imagine so.
Because
And
the first bullet says no employees.
Yeah, I think they're two separate. So facilitate processing of owner operated with no employees, but the second is to change the building code to not require F1. I see it as a long shot. I don't see where the state has ever loosened these types of building codes. And we're 0.2% of the population. I don't see this one going anywhere, but I'm also not against it. It's the ledge platform. And if there's opportunity, we should advocate. We have a lot of legacy cannabis that was being processed in buildings that do not and will never meet F1 occupancy.
Right, which also means that if they're not F1, if they do not meet F1 occupancy, they likely are not going to be required to meet ADA compliance. So we would be advocating for employees to work in trimming facilities that are not ADA compliant.
Yeah, and that's federal, and I think that's a waste of time. That's not going anywhere. Supervisor?
I think probably county council will have comments on that in particular. It seems, I agree with you, it's not likely to change. And I obviously have concerns about investing time or having things in our platform that might unintentionally harm other individuals. I mean, that's my concern on that particular one.
Well, what would you like to do with the building code item? Do you support the first bullet?
I do.
Okay, so let's give that as direction to incorporate the first bullet, and we can come back for.
So just to be clear, the first bullet is already allowed.
Okay, so then I'm fine skipping over 7 for now. We can revisit at a later date what to do about F1 and look at unanticipated consequences.
Okay. Item 8 is to restrict the Type 5 license. So the Type 5 license was held off to be reassessed by the state, and the earliest it could be implemented is 2023 if deemed necessary. The Type 5 is specifically a cultivation license that would allow for cultivation of more than an acre. To be clear, cultivation of more than an acre is already allowed via license stacking. So the request here is to support an increased Type 5 fee structure for new applicants that is commensurate with the size of these operations and their footprint on the local cannabis industry relative to small operators. I would say that we strongly support that. The first bullet point, I apologize, skipped over, is to create an acreage cap on Type 5 licenses. And the third point is to limit issuance of new type 5 licenses based on a lottery system. And then the fourth point is to combine type 5 licenses held by existing licensees to streamline the regulatory process. So I'm assuming that last bullet point means forcing stacked licenses that are larger than a medium into a type 5 license.
Is the lottery system being discussed at a state level, or is that a unique idea for Mendocino?
This is new as far as I'm aware of. I have not heard this previously discussed, nor was the lottery system brought up during our meeting with MCA and the other advocacy groups. Concerns that I have about a lottery system is lottery systems generally drive up the price of licensing pretty significantly. Because it just increases the value if there's a shortage of said license type.
Yeah.
But other than that,
So I support item 8, but I don't support the lottery system without hearing more information, like unanticipated consequences, whether there's partners across the state that would advocate with us. I don't know that we want to go in alone on that. It's not enough of a complete idea in my mind. And I'm concerned that we give equal access to all Mendocino County residents. I'm worried that the lottery could have unanticipated consequences, that some legacy small farms get left out. But I'm open to hearing more. Supervisor?
Yeah, I agree. And just generally, I'm not in support of limiting businesses that can be successful and have appropriate land. So I have some concerns about this one and didn't really have enough information.
Well, then do you want to hold off on 8 altogether? We can revisit it with more detail later.
I would appreciate that.
Okay. And then we're on to 9, which is a recommendation from Origins Council. State licensing reform.
yes, so authorize the state licensing authority to recognize 2 types of state licenses, ministerial and state discretionary license. That may prove to be challenging, as the response we've gotten from the state in a number of conversations is that Proposition 64 is what determines the discretionary action. I do think the CEQA item in the legislative platform is in alignment with Proposition 64, which requests that the state, or has language in it that says the state can provide guidance to local jurisdictions about how to address the CEQA requirements, therefore kind of punting it back to local control to hopefully be able to utilize their general plans. But we can put it in there even, and then let Ledge Council potentially, if a bill were to come up, address the difference between the ability for the state to issue ministerial versus discretionary licenses.
Supervisor, any advice?
I'm fine with that.
Okay. Let's move on to 10, regulatory streamlining.
Do you want to, before going to 10, discuss these bioregional EIRs that are proposed by Origins Council?
I'm not against it. I mean, I think this relates to another item in the Ledge platform, no unfunded state mandates. So if the state wants to pay for regional environmental impact reports, that's great. The more they can pick up on this program, the better. This is a state program, and they're sticking rural government with tasks that we just can't afford to carry out. But I don't think, I can't speak for the whole board. I think it would be difficult in Mendocino County with our finances the way they are to support participating in an EIR at our expense.
And so this is 2-part bioregional assessments and bioregional model ordinances. Potentially the model ordinance development fits in with comments we've heard from other board members and could be peeled out as an item for the Ledge platform.
So I'd like to give 9 to the cannabis program to attempt to integrate. Use your discretion and bring us back a draft of the changes.
Okay.
And again, I'm looking for opportunities where we don't stand alone, where other counties will advocate with us. And so if there's some overlap within this item, I think that's great. And again, I think your discretion. Mulhern, would you agree?
I do agree.
Okay, so 10, regulatory streamlining.
Okay, thank you for that. Advocate for the removal of barriers to entry for the rural legacy producing communities, including eliminating duplicative licensing requirements, such as, say, having to provide the same information on various maps for DFW, water boards, and say the state. So that's, I think, what that's in reference to. And then reforming incongruous regulations, supporting realistic compliance guidelines, and reducing the cost of compliance and licensing. This statement as a whole could get tucked into a regulatory streamlining component if the board or the committee is supportive of that.
Yeah, I support that. Supervisor?
Agree.
Okay, 11, cannabis appellations program.
Cannabis appellations programs are scheduled to kick off on January 1st of 2021. This is asking for advocate for the implementation. So again, the implementation is going to kick off on January 1st of 2021. Advocate for CDFA to develop educational materials and guidelines to support producing communities interested in developing petitions. That would be easy to fold in. Advocate for the promulgation of comprehensive labeling requirements. The labeling requirements have largely been removed from the regulations that will implement on January 1st. So the third bullet point, which I just read, seems to make quite a bit of sense. Allocate for sufficient budget for CDFA to cover the management of the program and create a review panel. Both of those items we would strongly support here in the cannabis program.
Okay, so 11,
3, 2,
Supervisor,
3, and
do you
4.
support it? 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah, I think the board has consistently
Yeah.
with this program.
And I agree. I think this is the same as previous direction given. 12, Board of Forestry fire safe regulations.
Yes, so advocate for parity between cannabis and agricultural crops within the development of the Board of Forestry fire safe road regulations, and advocate against unreasonable regulations that will be impossible for small rural homestead farmers to achieve. It's my understanding that the Board of Forestry fire safe regulations are a legislative mandate. They will impact all commercial activities on roads that are not of Category 4, including agricultural activities on roads that are not Category 4. And I wasn't listening fully earlier, my apologies, because I'm also supposed to be in the CAC meeting today. But I'd like to ask Judy if this is already included broadly in the ledge platform to advocate for sensible Board of Forestry fire safe road regulations.
Very broadly, I will go back and compare the two just to make sure they're a little bit more aligned.
What's key for me is treating cannabis and other ag crops the same in regard to fire safe regulations and roads.
Got it.
Supervisor, are you good with that?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. 13, cannabis, hemp, land use and product testing standards.
Right. So this is advocating for the alignment of land use, pesticide, and product testing standards for hemp produced for human consumption. So what that would mean is asking that all hemp production be treated in the same manner when it comes to the regulatory framework that cannabis cultivators are currently under. I do have some concerns with this, as the goal has been to have cannabis be treated more like ag, and hemp is treated like ag, that if we ask hemp to be treated like cannabis, we're cross messaging potentially. I'm on that first bullet point.
Supervisor?
Yeah, I agree. I think the intent is to have it treated, to have cannabis treated like ag, and we don't need to have hemp treated like cannabis. We need cannabis to be treated like ag. So
Yeah,
with that words.
I fully support that. If you, Kristen, if you could rephrase this to treat cannabis as, regulate cannabis as we regulate hemp.
Okay.
14, cannabis tax restructuring. I support it. And we recently sent a resolution to the state, in essence, supporting it.
Correct. So this is, do we need to add any wording in addition to what is currently in there about or proposed in the ledge platform for the elimination of the cultivation tax? I do have some concerns that if we ask for a restructuring, we're potentially moving towards supporting a revenue neutral model. And currently it is my belief, and then we've seen a lot of warnings from the CAC and Treasurer Fiona Ma that, and the State Attorney General, that without being able to bring the price down to the consumer, we won't increase the access to consumers and potentially be competitive with the illicit market. I just don't want to suggest that we would support a restructuring that might keep us in the same amount of taxes to the consumer.
What I hear is you think instead we should support striking the tax altogether.
Striking the cultivation tax altogether and potentially, clarifying what we mean by restructuring. So I just would hate for restructuring to be considered adding a tax at a different level in the supply chain, perhaps, and or increasing, say, the excise tax to make up for an elimination of the cultivation tax. So,
Supervisor?
Yeah, I agree that it needs more clarification, and also, again, would like to include tax credits and changes to the tax code to treat cannabis businesses like other businesses. The line at the end, I wasn't clear on, so maybe if we have a public comment from MCA, they can clarify that, how this would increase consumer access to regulated cannabis products. If it's a decrease in the price, then I understand that. But if there was some other intent behind that sentence, I was unclear.
Agreed. And staff, MCA will likely give us public comment to clarify that point, and staff will adjust the language to clarify that restructuring means striking the existing tax, not reclassifying it, renaming it, or applying it elsewhere in the chain. 15, interstate commerce and federal cannabis policy reform. I support it.
and I do believe that it is
And it's already in the ledge platform.
Yep.
Okay. Now it's all for the MCA memo. Any further staff or comment from the supervisor before we go to public?
No, thank you very much.
Kristen, thank you for jumping in. I know you're likely supposed to be somewhere else. I appreciate you going through this with us.
Yes, thank you, Kristen. I have a couple comments, unless Supervisor Mulhern has anything else.
I don't have anything else to add at this point.
So just a quick little housekeeping item. Do you want this? It is slated to go in front of the full board, as I've mentioned, January 4th. Of course, do you want it? Are you ready for it to go? Do you want it to come back? Although the makeup of this committee might be different.
I would prefer, I think we gave enough input. I think it should go to the full board next.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, that's all I have.
Great, we made it through the ledge platform.
Thank you both.
Comment. We need to do public comment.
Is there any public comment?
Yes, there is. First on the line, we have Jude Philman, followed by Ron Edwards.
Okay.
Jude, you could begin when you're ready.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Great. All right, thank you. All right, so my comments, I'm editing rapidly as you're responding point by point, and I appreciate that you did that. The overarching thing I would say first, before addressing some of the questions that you raised and going over our 15-point memo is, and first of all, I'm sorry, Jude Tillman speaking as co-chair of Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. The first overarching thing I would say is that we don't get the memos or the write-ups that MCP provides to the Board of Supervisors in a timely fashion. So the directive that you've made, Supervisor Williams, to have the Mendocino Cannabis Program take a look at these and rework them and is great, but we would like to be involved in that process. And as the representative of the stakeholders and small farmers, principally that's in our mission for this county, to be involved in discussions of the legislative platform coming from Mendocino County all along, we would have been able to work out a lot of stuff together. The F1 building, what do we mean by restructuring or restricting type 5 licensure? A lot of the questions that just came up in your discussion, we could have worked some of that stuff out. And so I would urge you to include us. We want to work with you. We've said that at the end of every testimony and memo we've ever made to you. So that's the main overarching framework I'd like to make. So to the specifics here, hold on one second. The market expansion, the question was how you add some language in to provide examples. And that's what's very important. And that's what we've added in our recommendation. So you're in spirit, the county already supports market expansion for small farmers, and that's great. What we want to do is really give examples of how the farmers markets or direct farm sales direct to consumers or direct from producers to consumers through other kinds of programs that we're creating. We'd like to make sure that those are specified so that they don't get lost in the mix. The need for tax relief, I think there was expressed in your discussion some confusion about what we meant. I think dropping the cannabis cultivation tax is just simple. That's a simple statement that we think it should be removed completely. And with regard to retail sales, they should be based on net sales, just like any other retail establishment in the county. Again, we're just seeking parity with other businesses.
So Jude, can I stop you right there? And we're going to halt the time as well. Can you, Kristen, can you, I know you had some confusion on this. Can you ask your question and let Jude clarify?
Yeah, I think you all can hear me. But it's my understanding that sales taxes on gross receipts, and it's at the cash register for all items, right? When it comes to sales tax, the retail excise tax for cannabis is calculated at the distributor. It is theoretically based on gross receipts. So I'm not sure what is meant by net sales, that it would not be a consumer paid tax. It would be changed to a completely different taxation mechanism than what's presented in the current excise tax.
Yeah, I don't quite understand the question because you said it's theoretically not gross receipts. It's not theoretical. It is on the retail level. The sales tax is being paid based on the gross price of the product. Like that includes all the overhead, all of the payment to the distributors. It's not. You go into any other retail store and anywhere, and the sales tax is paid at the register. The net sales is the net sales price of an item. That's what the net sales tax is made up of. So I'm not quite sure.
Well, I think we're saying the same thing, to be honest with you, Jude. So it's the gross price at the register, right? It's the price that's charged before, say, the retail establishments balances the books and says, okay, we charge this much in gross receipts. That's what the tax is based on. And then they subtract their operating business expenses from those bulk gross receipts. So I think, are you suggesting that the excise tax would be assessed at the register similar to a sales tax or any other type of sales or use tax.
Right, it would be based on the net cost, not the gross receipts.
But it is the gross receipts. I mean, like when you add up the receipts of someone purchasing 5 items, that's the gross receipt. That's the gross revenue coming into the business. And it's based on that gross cost. Net receipts would assume that the taxes are being assessed after the business finalizes their tax statement, and then they're taxed on their net.
No, we're not. We're taxed on the gross cost of an item, which includes a lot of things that are not included in a net sales item price, upon which most retail establishments pay their sales tax. So I don't know if we're talking across purposes here or not.
Jude, I wonder if you could offline put together a concrete example of how it works for
Sure.
a cannabis retail, and
Yeah.
side by side with how it works for other retail, so that we can see the discrepancy. In concept, I support it. I'm not seeing the nuances here.
Okay, yeah, we'll reword that.
And then your concern about ample time. This won't be the cannabis program bringing an update forward. It'll be, which may be under the CEO report, and the timing on that is a little bit shorter. This will be agendized as a standard item for the Board of Supervisors Ledge platform update. My recommendation for MCA and anybody else, if you have a change, don't show up and just give 3 minutes talking about it. Put together a red line, show us a specific change that you want. And I think that'll make it, my sense is the board tends to be in favor of advocating for small cannabis farms. So if we understand the change and it's submitted in writing, it's really easy to say yes, incorporate that. It's a little bit harder to take significant public expression and distill it to the ideal change set.
I agree, and that's why I made the point at the top that it would be very good if we could work together, sit down at the table and iron out some of these details. I want to make one other point though before I lose my time here, and that is about the acreage and the type 5 licenses. The big reason for all of that is that we've seen an egregious amount of license stacking, and that hurts the small farmer. That's something that they can't participate in, that very large entities can participate in, and we don't want cannabis production to blow up as we've seen in places like Santa Barbara. We want to keep Mendocino as Mendocino. With regard to the lottery system, that's been used by the state and mostly in local jurisdictions to identify equity applicants. It's also been used within the industry for small farmer participation in very large markets, such as the Emerald Cup. So it is possible to create a lottery system for new type 5 licenses. And this is not out of the reach of experience. Then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that treating cannabis like ag and regulating it the same as we do hemp doesn't capture the different standards that are being applied to the two. So that brings up the potential detriment of quality that's needed for human consumption, especially as we view cannabis, full whole plant cannabis, as medicine for human consumption. So that would not be the right direction to go.
Yep.
And then the question that I think Supervisor Mulherin had about what did we mean by tax restructuring, if it was simply to make the point that we want to decrease the price to the consumer, which again opens up market access. That is exactly correct. And we fully support Supervisor Williams looking for partners to join, which is why we're so active in Origins Council. But there's also many other partners on the legislative scene who are in support of many of our recommendations. And again, if we can work together to fine tune these recommendations, we'll be happy to answer some of those nuances that you refer to, Supervisor Williams.
Jude, please thank MCA for taking the time to author and submit this memo and your time explaining it.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate your kind attention.
Okay, next.
Next in the line is Ron Edwards.
Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. And thank you, Supervisor Williams, for taking the time to go over these items. I think what the tax issue is there's an excise tax that's placed. In other words, that the state is calculating what the price of cannabis is going to be or what it sells for, and the tax is based on that, whereas it should really be based on what it actually sells for, not a artificial created. As far as the cap goes, I think that Mendocino and smaller counties in far as population should really be advocating for the cap, because it is a drain on resources to deal with these larger operations. And I don't think it's the spirit of what was intended in Prop 64, with 68% of the state not being available for sales. So we really would like to keep it. I would like to see cultivation remain small and craft. As far as the federal level goes, I think that you're approaching it correctly with cannabis being like hemp, because that would alleviate the banking situations, a lot of these building processes, and we could just look at it as strictly agriculture when it comes to that. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate you guys taking effort into this.
Hey, Ron, you have some good ideas. Would you be willing to bring back red line versions? What is the state tax that you want changed specifically so that we know what to advocate for?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the time.
Next.
That concludes public comment.
All right. Any final comments from Supervisor Mulhern or staff on this item?
I don't have any, thank you.
Okay, direction was given.
Thank you both supervisors. This is Judy Morris from the Executive Office. Were you looking for some of those changes to come back from members of the public at the time of our board meeting in January?
I mean, if you have a way for the cannabis program to work with industry, that would be better than having extensive changes and public comment at the meeting. So I'm going to leave it to your discretion. I don't know if you have a town hall scheduled or any other way to get that input.
Well, this is Judy, not Kristen. Yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking of staff as a whole. I just know that it's not on me.
I understand that.
If I'm hopeful that the MCA and other cannabis industry folks who are watching will recognize that the way to influence this process is provide specific changes, show that red line. And if it's in line with the direction given today, I imagine Kristen will be able to integrate it. If it's outside of cannabis, I hope Judy has an opportunity to attempt to integrate it if it's within the spirit. And and then I expect there may be some fine tuning by the full board when it's presented.
And I would just thank you, Supervisor. I would just leave with reminding members of the public that there are some really key concepts in whatever category we're talking about. And so if something's not completely full of detail, doesn't mean it won't get looked at. And by that, I mean upcoming legislation. So we're having our eyes on all kinds of legislation moving forward. So that is all I have. Thank you both. It was very helpful.
Okay. And agenda item 3A, approval of minutes of the August 9th, 2021 General Government Committee meeting. Did you move approval?
Yep.
Okay, second. Does clerk want to conduct a roll call vote?
Which phone number?
Sure. Supervisor Mulhern?
Yes.
Supervisor Williams?
Yes.
The motion carries unanimously.
And I believe we have nothing on 3C announcements and 3D matters from staff. Are we ready to adjourn?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.